Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Ayanda Mbata and I'm the Relationship Manager at Turn Left Media. As many of you know, Turn Left Media is the exclusive media partner for LinkedIn in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now to dive straight into the topic of today, we know how long it takes to close a deal. In B2B, it's 6 months on average, but depending on the deal size and its complexities, it can be much longer. B2B marketing is often seen as a nice to have versus a need to have. But that's changing quickly as we start to recognize how important it is to set up the sales team in large B2B businesses for success. We delve into the fundamental principles that have allowed B2C brands to flourish and that has now been applied to B2B marketing. In this session, we'll outline how these laws come together and the key concepts B2B marketers should take away from the research. We have industry experts joining us today from the B2B Institute at LinkedIn and the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute all the way from Australia. Now, just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the conversation, please type them into the chat box and we'll be sure to respond as we go. Now, without further ado, we will turn to Jennifer Shaw-Sweet, who is the EMEA lead for the B2B Institute at LinkedIn. Jennifer comes with a wealth of information around media, having worked at JWT London, Saatchi & Saatchi, and BBDO, amongst others. At the B2B Institute, a think tank funded by LinkedIn, they research how to accelerate growth in business-to-business relationships. Jen, it is so wonderful to have you back again, and thank you for the time today. Over to you, my friend.
And thank you for having me today. I'm Jenny Shaw-Sweet, and you can find me and my colleagues at the B2B Institute at LinkedIn on LinkedIn, or check out our B2B Institute LinkedIn page for updates and our latest research or events. The B2B Institute is a think tank funded by LinkedIn that gathers the best in marketing research in the B2B sector and frequently commissions B2B research and B2B cuts of key research to bring best practice and data-led thinking to B2B marketers. Our mission is to champion and empower B2B marketers. We uncover provocative, thought-provoking, and dare I say, controversial marketing thinking with an approach that is based on data rather than opinion. And to this end, we enthusiastically embraced working with the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute at the University of South Australia to develop narratives that brought their thinking and research to a B2B audience with data cuts that were the most relevant for the category. In our team, this research was led by John Lombardo, the B2B Institute's head of research, and championed by Jan Schwartz, the global head of the B2B Institute. I'm absolutely thrilled to be presenting today alongside Mr. John Dawes, or Professor John Dawes, of the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute today. And I can only hope to do a little justice to his brilliance, the brilliance of his thinking here in a very whistle-stop summary of the principles that the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 team, the Institute's team, and their research included in our recent publication, How B2B Brands Grow. This is available to download for free from our website, b2binstitute.org. Today, we're going to frame that research in the context of a B2B case study. So this morning, like you, I'm keenly looking forward to hearing more detail from John about these ideas and how they can be applied to our B2B businesses in the future. Now, let's start with the basic truth. Every brand has an awareness problem. Take the biggest B2B brand in the world, Salesforce. Most professionals have heard of Salesforce, and people often know Salesforce from its logo or events or the Salesforce towers in various global hubs. But while their presence is greater in, say, the US than Latin America, Europe, Africa, or the Middle East, what's key is that while we may have heard of Salesforce, most of us often don't know what Salesforce actually sells. Even though most people know the brand, very few people can remember the services and products that Salesforce deliver. And knowing what a company sells is an important step to actually selling something. The concept of a brand coming to mind in a buying situation or knowing what a brand sells is called mental availability. We like the phrase situational awareness because it's an easier way to understand what mental availability means in reality, the probability that your brand comes to mind in different buying situations. In order to solve its brand awareness problem, Salesforce launched its Trailblazer campaign in 2019. The objective of the campaign was to explain to people what Salesforce actually sells and to which categories. The Astro character seen here does a great job in illustrating not only how Salesforce brings companies and customers together, its most intuitive buying situations, but also how it brings government and citizens together, as well as manufacturers and customers. It's incredibly flexible as an asset. By linking the brand to more buying situations, Salesforce shows how share of mind, share of the brain cells, the brand occupies and keeps current in the brains of customers, and that presence drives share. Specifically, Salesforce shows how investing in an ownable brand asset, such as a wacky raccoon-bear hybrid, builds mind share, and mind share drives market share. The idea of share of mind or mind share driving market share is essentially mental availability, which is the primary job of marketing, and it's what we're going to talk about the most today. Now, we partnered with the 𝑬𝒉𝒏𝒏 Institute, the world's biggest institute for marketing science research, to explore how to grow brands, increase market share, and build sales, specifically in B2B. Now, some of you may have read Byron Sharp's famous marketing book, How Brands Grow. And for those of you who have, we're very excited to be bringing the ideas from that foundational work to the world of B2B. Today, we're going to show how the 95 rule, the B2B brand rejection research, the duplicate purchase law, and the double jeopardy law all indicate that building mental availability is the single most important objective in B2B advertising. First, the 95-5 rule. Let's start with a surprising marketing myth. Most marketers believe that advertising works by moving people through the funnel in the short term. And short term in marketing is even shorter than you think. Most marketers expect to see results in just 2 weeks. Now let's look at how marketing actually works. Not only does marketing not work in the short term, it doesn't move people through an actual funnel. The funnel is only a mental model. The reality is much more messy. Most of the time, people are outside the funnel. At the bottom of funnel, we're just converting existing demand. So most marketing doesn't even reach people who are in the funnel. Marketing works by reaching people who aren't thinking about buying right now, but are just the group of people who can buy. And that's what we're talking about when we say a category marketplace. This is why top of funnel, bottom of funnel is the wrong mental model. Buyers are either in market or out of market, which is the right mental model. The 95-5 rule shows that most marketers are out of market at any given time. In market, out of market isn't just a mental model. There's actually a lot of data showing that this is the reality. 75 to 90% of buyers for business computers or B2B banking and cars are out of market in any given period. And if they don't know when they're going to come into market, there is no way that you can know when they're going to come into market. And so we're already too late. Our esteemed guest, Professor John Dawes, the author of our 95-5 paper, makes a critical point that if buyers don't know you when they enter the market, there's no way they're going to consider you. Your job as an advertiser is to make sure that you're building mental availability among people who aren't in market, so that when they are, your brand is the one that they're familiar with and they have confidence in. Familiarity is so important because people don't really evaluate, they buy what's mentally available. Even with high involvement purchases like B2B banking, little evaluation in reality occurs. Nearly half of buyers went straight to their current bank when they needed a new banking service. And among those who did actually say they evaluated other options, ultimately 75% of them still ended up with their current bank. Regardless, buyers evaluate less than 2 brands on average when any evaluation occurs at all. Often we'll see that as post-rationalization or post-evaluation. So if a buyer doesn't know you when they enter the market, it truly is too late. The problem with our marketing funnel myth earlier is that it leads marketers to believe that they have the power somehow to magically move people in market, and that that's the job of advertising. But in reality, ads don't put buyers in market. Buyers put themselves in market. They're the only ones who know when they're going to have the money. The job of advertising isn't to nudge or nurture people through the funnel or to persuade buyers actively evaluating their options. The job of advertising is to become mentally available among those who are out of market, so that you're the first brand they think of when they come in market. And most of the time, the first brand thought of is the one that is bought. Salesforce understands that most of its growth is going to come from people who aren't in market today. The job of their advertising is not to generate immediate sales, but to build immediate availability that compounds over time and translates into future sales. By building links between Salesforce and its category entry points, Salesforce ensures that more category buyers will consider them when they enter a key buying situation. Next, we're going to talk about B2B brand rejection. Now let's discuss our second marketing myth of the day. Most marketers think brand rejection is a really big problem. In fact, 71% of marketers believe that perception is a far bigger concern than brand awareness. In reality, very few buyers have perceptions of your brand to begin with. Instances of active brand rejection are therefore incredibly rare. We worked with the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute to survey buyers of B2B banking and insurance services and found that 90% of people who had heard of a brand don't actively reject it. Even people who have previously used a brand's services and have since defected from that brand would still not actively reject it for a future purchase. This is the case for 2 in 3 people that we surveyed. The real problem marketers face is not brand rejection, it's brand unawareness or lack of awareness. Most people don't think about your brand at all. In B2B banking in particular, you can see that rejection rates are significantly lower than unawareness rates across the board. Rejection is low for big brands like Barclays, and it's low for small brands like Yorkshire. But whereas Barclays, the most famous brand in the category, has 1.6 times more unawareness than rejection, small brands like Yorkshire have unawareness rates as high as 7.4 times their rejection rates. Lack of awareness is clearly a far more pressing concern for marketers than active brand rejection. Rather than obsessing over perception, marketers should obsess over awareness. As Professor Jenny Romanishek, the author of our brand rejection report, so aptly puts it, stop imagining why people might not like the brand and instead focus on building mental structures, that memorability. Salesforce understands that achieving awareness is the ultimate aim of its advertising, rather than seeking approval or mitigating risk. Advertising creativity is often so stifled in B2B because of buttoned-up corporate culture. Most B2B managers believe there's no room for bold, unique, or creative ideas when selling business products and solutions, and suggesting otherwise, as Salesforce's VP of Marketing, Colin Fleming, once did, tends to draw a lot of internal criticism. Fleming faced a lot of internal backlash when he proposed the Trailblazer campaign. People felt a company of Salesforce's size and scale had no business showing furry characters frolicking in the forest. But ultimately, the Trailblazer campaign more than proved its worth. Fleming and his team aren't inspired by Microsoft or SAP, they're inspired by Disney, and every other brand marketing team should follow suit. Aspire towards exceptional creative with powerful, distinctive brand assets, because that's the key to building mental availability and structures for memory. Now on to our third marketing myth of the day and the duplicate purchase law. Marketers think perception and positioning determine their competition. Most of you are probably familiar with perceptual maps like the ones shown on the slide here. You've likely hired expensive consultants or put this type of map together to identify key segments for you to target, which is fair enough. They would probably have run really fancy statistical analyses and teased apart several different dimensions across which to assess your category based on behavior preference, using quirky labels like mums who work or young upwardly mobiles. And the key here is to identify your direct competitors based on who else occupies your segment or niche. Life would be so great if you could determine your competition like this, but the reality is it's really hard. Positioning and perception don't determine your competition. Penetration determines your competition. Why? Well, because no image or positioning exercise will determine who you really compete with. Your buyers determine who you compete with. You compete with the brands that immediately come to mind when they enter a buying situation, because as we established earlier, buyers don't evaluate, they choose the brand that's the most mentally available. And typically, those mentally available brands are the biggest brands in the category, the ones with the most market penetration. The sad but undeniable truth of market competition is the fact that you must compete with the biggest brand in the category. There's no way around it. This is called the duplicate purchase law, and it's a law because it holds true in every category, no matter how you position your brand or who you consider your direct competitors to be. Your direct competitors will always be the biggest brands in the category. So take our B2B banking data. Those who defect from big banks proportionately end up at big banks, and those who defect from medium-sized banks disproportionately end up at big banks. And finally, those who defect from smaller banks disproportionately end up at big banks. The big banks take the lion's share every time, and hence they're big and they get bigger. So you may be thinking, okay, the big brands have an advantage when it comes to new customers, but I still have a lock on my current customers. Unfortunately, no, because the duplicate purchase law states that not only do you compete with the biggest brands, you actually share your customers with them. That's right, your current customers are actively buying from your biggest competitors. You may believe that this isn't true in B2B, what with annual purchasing contracts and loyalty programs, but it is, because you might have fixed term contracts with all of your customers, but your customers represent just one buying group in each account, and it's rare for any account, especially an enterprise level, to satisfy any business need exclusively with one vendor. So just take the fact that we work for Microsoft and use Zoom every day as an example. Beyond subscription purchases, there are many B2B purchases that are project-based and take off on a one-off basis, like freelance design services. And these are what we call repertoire purchases. And suppliers compete with the biggest vendor in the category every time. So much like it's easy to see why Starbucks would compete with Peet's or Pret-a-Manger or La Colombe for coffee drinkers all the time, it's easy to understand how vendors compete with B2B transactional purchases on an ongoing basis. And every time in the subscription and repertoire categories, you compete with the biggest brands in the category. Now let's take the B2B aviation fuel example. The market leader in this category is Shell, and as shown in the penetration figures on the slide. Now let's look at customer sharing, in other words, of the customers. Now let's look at customer sharing, in other words, of the customers who buy each of these brands, who buys from the other brands. What we see here is that Shell has the highest number of customers, of shared customers from every single brand. Both BP customers also buy from Shell over any other brand. Most total customers also buy from Shell over any other brand, and so on and so forth. On average, Shell wins more shared customers than any other brand, simply because it's the biggest brand in the category. Penetration determines your competition among shared and future buyers. This all comes down to one simple truth. The biggest brands have the most mental availability, and the brands that build the most mental availability are the ones that grow, because buyers buy what's mentally available. So just take a look at this direct correlation between mental market share or mental availability and traditional market share. Clearly, big brands have natural advantages, and small brands don't advertise enough and are largely unheard of. But even the small brands who advertise must contend with the natural attention bias towards big competitors. In fact, poorly branded ads from small brands are often misattributed to the category leader. The key to stealing share of mind from your biggest competitors is to know that you're constantly competing with the biggest brands in the category and act like it. Invest heavy in heavy branding. Win the mind to win the market. Because Salesforce knew from the start that they weren't trying to own some kind of cloud niche. They were up against the biggest software brands in the world, and they actually acted like it. Their early ads pitted boldly up against the big software and did so with pithy slogans like "Die software, die" and "The cloud must go on." Importantly, their ads were heavily branded. Salesforce is now one of the biggest brands of the world, and they no doubt benefited from their big, bold advertising efforts in those early days. And let's talk about our final marketing myth of the day, double jeopardy. Marketers think brands can increase by growing customer loyalty. This is one of the most pervasive myths our team contends with. Despite shouting from the rooftop over the years that acquisition is the only path to growth, such as with our loyalty live trend in 2019, I think, we still see 65% of marketers saying that customer loyalty is the most important and more important than customer acquisition. Well, now we have empirical evidence to back us up. The double jeopardy law. Double jeopardy states that brands can only grow by acquiring new customers. And this is an immutable truth. It's called a law of marketing science because it, again, applies to all categories. And we're so excited to be able to show that this truth holds true in B2B. Let's break this down as a case in point. To become the biggest brand in your category, so that's the brand with the most market share, you need to grow your customer base. This seems intuitive, but it's worth taking a look at. If we see the data from How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp, actual market penetration is directly correlated to market share, and the influence of loyalty is minimal. Purchase frequency was roughly the same across all brands, averaging at 1.7. Clearly, loyalty doesn't move the sales needle on market share growth. Penetration is the key growth driver. Not only does penetration drive market share growth, it also drives loyalty, hence the double jeopardy effect. Small brands are punished twice. They acquire fewer customers and experience lower loyalty rates. Our data on B2B banking shows that the double jeopardy law holds true in all categories, even in B2B. The double jeopardy effects don't just stop there. Not only does penetration drive market share and loyalty, it also drives perception. Why? Well, because the biggest brands are the most familiar and people favor familiarity. Take a look at this data on the OTT service category. Netflix is clearly the market leader and is perceived as having the best original programming. Prime Video comes in second on both counts, followed by Disney and Hulu, which are roughly tied. Data is clear, all favourable marketing outcomes are a function of penetration. In fact, Professor Andrew Ehrenberg himself once said, of the 1001 variables which might affect buying behaviour, it is found that 999 usually don't matter. Everything comes down to penetration, and penetration drives an all-important buying behaviour. As marketers, you may want to achieve favourable perception and customer loyalty, and that's totally valid. But the key to achieving these metrics is not to focus on them, it's to solely focus and obsessively focus on penetration. Salesforce understands this, which is why the job of their marketing team is to acquire new customers. They do so using their Trailblazer campaign, which we've established as a leader in building mental availability at scale. Salesforce's marketing team focuses on future customers, and the current customer experience is left up to other teams, like the ones that run Salesforce's Trailhead program. Trailhead is Salesforce's online education platform to help customers make the most of their experience. Interestingly enough, the Trailhead characters were such a hit that they were Fleming's inspiration behind the Trailblazer campaign. So it just goes to show that distinctive brand assets can come from anywhere. The key is to make them just really distinctive. Loyalty is not a marketer's job. Marketers must focus exclusively on marketing penetration by building mental availability with heavy brand investment, and the rest will follow. So the challenge to grow is to build mental availability. Mental availability is about being remembered. We need to win the mind to win the market. Using the RMB approach to be remembered, reach, messaging, and branding means that you can reach the whole category. And messaging around several category entry points means that you're able to demonstrate your relevance and engage and build memories around the associations that trigger those memories. And you need to brand everything and invest in distinctive brand assets. The first step to RMB is to reach everyone in the category. Now, LinkedIn's Campaign Manager tool makes this very easy to do, as we've illustrated in the finance category. You simply select the brand awareness objective and then target by company industry. And here we've selected each type of finance company to ensure that we're targeting the whole category. As you can see, that gives us the opportunity to reach 9.8 million relevant buyers. By targeting the category, you reach several important brand building benefits. You reach both in-market and out-of-market buyers. You reach buyers across all functions of the buying committee. And importantly, you reach buyers of various seniority levels, ensuring that your brand building efforts reach the junior employees today who are the decision makers of tomorrow. The next step in R&B is to message around category entry points. So first you must understand the key category entry points or buying situations in your category. Our friends at the 𝑚𝒉𝒆 Institute, which John is one, do this for companies using their proprietary CEP surveying methodology. Now we're actually working on them now with a way to find to beta test bringing this type of surveying directly to LMS clients through the B2B Edge program, which is our brand consultation service. And there's more information of this about this that's available through the guys at Turn Left. But once you know your category entry points, building messaging to link to your brand to them is important. And Salesforce again does an excellent job at this with their Trailblazer campaign. It illustrates how Salesforce is relevant to companies, government and manufacturers. And importantly, they make these seemingly complicated links very easy to visualize and understand using the fun, attention-grabbing character Astro to make each link exceptionally clear. Now, speaking of Astro, in the final step of R&B, we have branding. Now, Astro is a prime example of a powerful, distinctive brand asset. He's distinctive, ownable, and clearly attributed to the Salesforce brand. He's entirely whimsical and meaningless, and that's what's so great about him. The most effective, distinctive brand assets have no real meaning at all. Their lack of meaning is what makes them so distinctive and ownable. And of course, the branding in R&B requires that you brand everything. Salesforce makes sure its logo is visible on all of its advertising. And this may seem intuitive, but many ads don't feature the brand logo prominently or enough at all, or it sort of disappears at the end. Making sure you brand everything is really important, because if you don't, you run the risk of building mental availabilities for your bigger competitors. So to summarize, don't get distracted by other advertising objectives. All evidence points to mental availability. The 95/5 rule says you must prime future buyers with brand ads to grow. Our research on B2B brand rejection says that you must focus on awareness, not perception, to grow. The duplicate purchase law states that you must steal mind share from big brands to grow. And finally, the double jeopardy law says that you must reach future customers to grow, since all marketing outcomes are a function of penetration. To sum it all up, if you can reach the whole category with messaging around key entry points that's heavily branded and employs distinctive brand assets, you will build mental availability. And if you do this consistently over time, mental availability will compound and translate into future sales. Mental availability truly is the answer to how brands grow. I want to thank you for your attention during this session and open up to more questions.
Jen, that was so insightful. Thank you so much for letting us in on the true power of real data, and that we cannot just rely on mere opinion. I think a key takeaway for me was that very few buyers have true perceptions of brands out there. Therefore, much groundwork needs to be done, and also that marketers should obsess over awareness and memorability of their brand. Well, folks, next up, I'd like to introduce John Bowles, who is the founder and director of Turn Left Media. He will be hosting our panel discussion today. Together with John and Jen, we are joined by John Dawes, and John Dawes is the Associate Director for Operations at 𝑚𝒉𝒆 Institute at the University of Australia. The Institute's fundamental research is used and financially supported by many of the world's leading corporations, including Coca-Cola, Kellogg, Procter & Gamble, Turner Broadcasting, Mars Inc., and many others. John has over 20 years of marketing research experience. His areas of expertise are brand metrics, the effects of price promotions, market structure analysis, and repeat buying loyalty. John's research has been published in many top marketing journals, including the Journal of Advertising Research, Journal of Business Research, and Journal of Retailing. John's findings have also been published in the Wall Street Journal. John Bowles, I'd like to hand the mic over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks for the introduction, and wonderful to be here, and great privilege to have both John and Jen on here. Just to make it clear, I'm not the academic in the house. I am just the guy from Turn Left Media. And just a little bit further about Turn Left, we represent LinkedIn on the continent or sub-Saharan Africa for their marketing solutions, for anybody who doesn't know that. But this is a fireside. We're under the African skies. I can feel the heat coming from that beautiful savannah and the sky above. Can you guys feel it in Adelaide and in London? It's there, isn't it? But thanks, John. First of all, in true tradition on LinkedIn, you have to tell us what's not on your LinkedIn profile.
Okay, what's not on my LinkedIn profile? I didn't mention on my LinkedIn profile that I've cheated death many times.
Oh, wow, this is good. Explain more quickly.
Well, when I was younger, I led a very interesting life, and I think I was like a cat. I had 9 lives, and many instances where I probably put myself in personal danger, but somehow managed to escape without being killed in motorcycle accidents or other vehicular accidents or other misadventures. So I'm lucky to even be here.
That's why you landed up in the safe waters of marketing science.
Exactly.
But tell us more about the 𝑬𝒉𝒏𝒏 Institute and what your manifesto is, so to speak.
Sure. I mean, so the 𝑬𝒉𝒏𝒏 Institute, has its history back in the 1990s, and indeed even before that, when Professor Andrew Ehrenberg was running a program of research that was sponsored by corporations in the US and the UK and other places. We kind of took that program on, and today 𝑬𝒉𝒏𝒏 basically runs a consortium of research funding. So corporations around the world sponsor the 𝑬𝒉𝒏𝒏's work. We pool the funds, and we have a very large pool of PhD candidates and other researchers that do long-term research programs into marketing, and then we feed our results back to our sponsors in the form of reports and webinars and so on.
Well, for those that want a bit of the work, and certainly the B2B Brands paper, we'll be sending that out to all attendees. Afterwards, it will be available on our website. But I've worked with the EBI in the past, and I can tell you it's worth signing up to their work. I know that Jen will agree with that too, from a LinkedIn perspective, definitely. So let's get started with the fireside. And thanks, John, for giving us that background to the 𝑬𝒉𝒏𝒏 Institute. I know, Jen, you've given a bit of intro to B2B Institute too, or the B2BI, which we follow on LinkedIn religiously. But, there's a lot of talk about B2B and B2C and, differentials between the two. I mean, how did we get to this point where there's this difference in thinking around B2B and B2C marketing? Is there a difference or not? Should we be taking things differently? Because from what I can see, not really. John, maybe you can answer that as a start, and then you, Jen.
Yes, so I have an answer in 2 parts. I mean, there are some differences. B2B, typically you have fewer, larger buyers or clients, and perhaps each of them might account for a significantly larger proportion of your total business's revenue. There is often more of an emphasis on personal selling, account management, maybe sometimes prolonged negotiations and formal tenders to get work and things like that. So therefore some of the tools are different. There's an emphasis on some different aspects of the marketing mix. But unfortunately, I think what's happened is that people have lost sight of the fact that while there are those differences, the route to growth is actually the same. And this is what Jen was talking about before in her talk, in that, whether it's B2C or whether it's B2B, we can look at the easiest way to think about it, I think, is there are big brands in B2B and B2C, and the question is, what's the difference between them? Why are some brands big and some brands are small? And the answer to that is the same in B2B as it is in consumer markets. The little brands have got low levels of mental and physical availability. The big brands have high levels. Therefore, the marketing imperative is, well, okay, if I'm small and I want to get big, how can I cost effectively deploy and build mental and physical availability.
Thanks, Jen. I can see there's some London sunshine coming through there, something you don't see that often.
Such a rare thing. I'm in shock. If I start to dissolve, then you'll know that my skin just couldn't take it. No, I agree with John entirely, but I also would add that I think between B2B and B2C, I was just writing some notes, I think the thing that we worry about a lot in B2B is the buying committee. We're very, very aware of the fact that we're having to get a purchase either approved by a lot of people or actually through a lot of people. And so the focus has always generally been on rationalizing the purchase, like talking about all of the reasons to believe. And I think that we forget that there is an enormous amount of emotion in relating to and justifying a purchase to a buying committee. Like I have relatively little emotion walking into a corner shop and getting a drink. Like I to be honest, it's my fault if I make a terrible decision, and buy, the yogurt milkshake that's gone slightly off. But and I'm the only one that suffers from that. In B2B, if I make a bad decision as a buyer, it's a very emotional decision. You might not frame it like that traditionally, but it's an incredibly emotional decision in the fact that I might lose my job. I might get into loads of trouble with my boss. I seek approval from all of my peers. And so the reassurance that you get from mental availability, from actually, and I don't really just think about it in that way very often, but actually, if you're the first brand to market in the context of a buying situation, the first brand to mind in the context of a buying situation, you're the obvious choice in the brain of the consumer. And I think that in B2B, that is incredibly powerful if that is also true across your whole buying committee, because everyone in the meeting goes, yeah, of course, I'm going to buy, our example here, probably over-egged with Salesforce, but I'm going to buy, this brand or that brand. And if you get that approval, there is huge emotional reward from that. And I think that traditionally B2B has grown from sales, like B2B marketing has grown from sales. And it's sort of B2B sales and B2B marketing kind of tried to distinguish themselves between the guys in sales going, I'll manage the relationships, I'll manage the close relationships with the clients. Like sales is inherently an incredibly emotional discipline, even though salespeople will say, oh, no, I'm the person who knows the most about the product. It is all about emotional connection. And then they've gone to marketing, but I need you to set up the leads. I need you to go and create demand. And then, and then say, but it needs to be all about what's really brilliant about the product. That's what I say in my sales pitch. They forget that the beginning of the sales pitch is always emotion. It's always about creating a connection with the customer. And that's what drives preference for your brand. And I think if we start to sort of really look at the reality of what's going on here, the reality of how we really buy and sell, then actually you can see why mental availability is so incredibly powerful. Plus, and the most important thing is going to be reach here. If you ain't heard of it, you're not going to buy it. So the most important thing is to just have been heard of. And we sit there and convince ourselves in B2B that because we've got an amazing product, everyone's going to find us. And we're reassured in the early years of growing a business because we've got an amazing product and there is latent demand and people are out there searching for it. But as a category matures, and most of our categories mature quite quickly, you have to get the level of reach because you've just exhausted your, natural number of people who are going to somehow fall over you and be able to buy you. And driving preference drives everything and I would argue this really strongly in favor of brand, drives price option, it drives optionality, it drives price perceptions and pricing power. You start to have really healthy conversations as a seller once your brand becomes really famous. So that would be my difference between B2B, but also where I think we can do incredibly well as marketers to take these tactics just to human, as John said, to human beings, whether they're B2B or B2C.
Thanks, Jen. I mean, that is a comprehensive answer. And I'm going to get back into the buying committee a little bit later on. But John, I'm really interested more in the 95-5 rule, and it actually links into what Jen is talking about awareness and expectations in B2B. You know, we often are asked about generating leads all the time, leads for sales departments, and often, you know, the expectation is immediate. Now, on the 95-5 rule, I think it's quite a jaw dropper when you think about it, isn't it? I mean, there's only possibly 5% of people in the market. We know in B2B, sales cycles can last up to 6 months at least or more, depending on the decision being made. But how would you manage the expectation of these? You know, in B2B sales, they are demanding, they want leads, and the marketers are kind of pushed to just generate leads. But what should the expectation? I think if there's 5% in the market and you've got a 15% market share, for example, or can we only expect 5% or 15% of the 5%? Does that make sense?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that's kind of the default expectation. So, you know, if it's 5% in a month or a quarter, and I've got 15% market share, then what that means is for me to stay stable, then I'll be attracting 15% of that 5. That's kind of like the default. If I want to grow, then I need to get more than 15% of that 5. Like, in a sense, I can't grow the 5 part of it. Like, I can't force people to come to the market, but what I should be doing is trying to maybe get a little bit more than my fair share of the 15, okay, that I can get. But of course, what we're saying with the 95-5 rule is that we don't just think about the proportion who are coming into the market now or soon. We have to think 6 months' time, 12 months' time, 15 months' time, like our cash flow next year, you know, and if we're talking to the finance director, we use that sort of language. You know, let's talk about revenue and cash flow next year. We can start priming the pump for that now if we can deploy effective advertising for people who will come into the market in the future. If we can build some mental availability amongst them, we'll build some preference. We'll be in their minds, and so we should look forward to getting a larger share of those people who come into the market when they come into the market. So that's the idea of the 95-5 rule. Rather than focusing on the small proportion who are coming in now, let's think about all those people who could come in the future and like start building our brand amongst them.
And that's why reach and awareness are so critical in the ingredients here, is to constantly keep talking to them and reminding them. I'll talk a little bit later about creativity, but I'm thinking about the duplication purchase law and the double jeopardy law, and the B2B Institute did some great work with Rory Sutherland on the objectivity trap, a great paper where, you know, Rory's got an interesting sense of humor. I love it. But he talked about in B2B defensive decision making, and that probably also links up to B2B too, to these buying committees, etc. But what would the advice be to a dominant market leader in the space? And I'm going to ask it to both of you, if you don't mind. John, you can go first. And to a new kid on the block, so to speak, a small B2B company that's just trying to make it in the day and get going, convert leads and generate some cash for the business, and, you know, are all hands in. What would your advice be in that?
Yeah, okay, good question. So I think if you're the market leader, you firstly recognize you have an advantage in the market. You know, double jeopardy is kind of working in your favor. So the buyers that you have and that you get, you would expect a little bit more loyalty from them. Your rates of defection will be a little bit lower, again, in line with double jeopardy. A trap that market leaders kind of start falling into is they start thinking too much about preserving what they've got. They start forgetting about acquisition. So there's a famous quote from a marketing director for one of the really big Australian banks back some years ago. I mean, this is a consumer market example, but he was saying, well, you know, we've got 4.5 million customers. We don't need any more, okay? But they were neglecting the fact that all brands, all firms do lose some customers, and actually you have quite little control over how many customers you lose, because a lot of it isn't even defection. It's just some people just exit the market or just don't need you anymore. So, if you've got a client base of 4.5 million and you're losing 5% of them a year, then, you need hundreds of thousands of new customers recruited just to stand still. So that's the one thing. So if you're the market leader, you can't take your eye off penetration. You have to keep recruiting, even just to stay still. Secondly, I think avoid the trap of senior marketers and maybe even other managers in the business getting bored with things. So there's a tendency for people to want to change things. You have a new marketing director, what do they want to do? They want to change things up. We want a new look and feel. We think the logo's a bit outdated. Maybe we even commission some qual to confirm what I already believe, which is we need a logo refresh. So that you chuck out all of the market-based assets that you've earned and won over the years through years of consistent advertising. So yeah, be wary of losing sight of what made you successful. If you're the small newer player on the block, what's your big weakness? Your big weakness is people don't know about you. It's probably, your product could be fine. In fact, your product could be as good as the market leader, but you have to overcome that lack of mental availability. And you've probably got limited funds. So you have to be really, really careful and really disciplined to spend your money as kind of tightly as possible to reach people without undue duplication of frequency. Make sure your branding is fanatically well done so that it's unmistakably for you, and concentrate on fixing your weaknesses, which are probably overcoming a lack of mental availability and a lack of physical availability.
So, excellent. Jen, your thoughts?
It's hard to follow, but I think what I would say as a market leader, you always need to be relevant in a buying situation. And market leaders in particular struggle with a level of fame that means they may even become a household name, but if they're not relevant in a buying situation, they're not chosen. And I think driving that, actually communicating your category relevance, relevance in a buying situation is really important. The opportunities for optionality are often the way for a long-term brand, a large brand, to survive as well. And I think that you have to, as a brand, be aware of the fact of the health and the longevity of your category. And so you can sit really well as, the world's greatest producer of a product no one buys anymore. And so there's no point having 100% market share of a dead category, and actually really thinking about how you stay relevant, how you still fulfill a category need, a real need amongst your consumers, and that is a large enough need or a large enough part of the category that you continue to be profitable and large is always going to be a challenge. So I'd say that for a market leader, but my God, you're in a good situation to all of this research if you are there ahead. If you're a small business, I guess you've only got more to win, right? So you've got to reach more consumers. The positive news is if you're tiny, you can only, hopefully you can just keep on growing and growing. And having that growth mentality is really, really important, because you've got to have, I think, creative standout and creative disruption. The 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute had a wonderful hierarchy of what makes a difference. And by far, the biggest difference you're going to make in your marketing activities is reach. It's just reaching as many people as possible. And you've got to find a way of spending that means that you are always present in the minds of consumers. And I see far too many companies doing really sort of big bursts once a year. And then what you find is that big burst works for the 3 months that big burst maybe. It's not even that. I think one of the measures we had was that it's kind of one impact is remembered for maybe a couple of weeks, and then it's like someone else replaces you. So what you do need to do is you need to make sure that you have a presence all the way through the year in the brain of the consumer. I don't mean you have to spend every single day. If you're a small brand, that's just not realistic, but trying to keep yourself topped up, trying to keep that presence there, I think is really important. But I would also say use your tininess to kind of use the fact that also means it's less of a risk to be disruptive, and actually be disruptive and standing out creatively would be my top tip.
Yeah, I like that. Use your tininess. Let's use that tininess and move forward. I like that. But I mean, there are constraints, budget constraints, and I buy into the reach arguments, and I buy into an always-on approach because of the 95 rule. But John told me, in B2B we talk about the buying committee and defensive decision making, and having to get this collective thumbs up. What would your advice be to, if I've got budget constraints, out of those factors, always on, need to be there, need to be reaching the full category? Do we start to sacrifice some members of the buying committee? Because we know often maybe junior members are doing research for senior members that, are helping them make this decision. There's so many complicated structures within these buying committees. What advice should I be giving our clients in respect of, when there's a budget constraint there and the buying committee? John?
Yes, it's a good one, and it's a complex one because, it's easy to think that perhaps the most senior member of a buying committee is the person who makes the decision, but it might all be sort of the case that they're really busy and so they delegate somebody, at the middle level, no, you make the, it's your decision, you just tell me what you've done. I mean, if you have the ability to, reach all members of a buying committee, I think that's super important. And I think perhaps a lot of B2B marketers perhaps underestimate the extent to which their mental availability extends into all of the relevant players in an organization. So, for argument's sake, a standard B2B brand tracking method is you track something like brand awareness and other things, and you contact a respondent inside a sample of companies, which at face value seems fine. And you could say, well, actually, 27% of respondents in this sort of client base are aware of our brand or have some level of mental availability, which is fine, but it could be there's a dozen or 20 people inside lots of those organizations who might have some influence on whether your brand is bought. And there's a question of, well, how good are we at actually reaching those multiple people that exist inside our client organizations? I would kind of think about the problem this way. I mean, yes, if you have a way to reach multiple people inside an organization, that's great. Another way of thinking about the problem is just think about how many buying committees you can at least get on the list of, right? So if, for argument's sake, you find that typically clients in our industry, and we could take an example like corporate banking, would perhaps seriously evaluate 2 to 3 providers, okay, before they make a decision like, trade finance or cash management or something like that. I mean, and a lot of focus perhaps of salespeople is, all right, I'm on the list, so I've got to be chosen, which is fine. But also if you determine, okay, so on average 3 brands are considered, what that means is for every extra corporation that we get on the list of, we've got a 33% chance of getting bought. So the focus should be on how many more clients can we become known enough to at least get on their list of suppliers. And that's a way of thinking about it. And we came to this realization from some of the work that Jen talked about back at the start. If consideration sets something like 2 brands, that means, well, for every kind of serious inquiry you get, there's a 50% chance of turning it into a sale. So how can we get more inquiries? How can we get on the list of more potential clients?
Great, thanks, John. I'm just conscious of time. We're running out. So, Jen, I'm going to quickly ask you a question around creative execution. We talked about distinctive assets, and you were quite vocal about emotional advertising in B2B. And I get it. Often in B2B, we think that decisions are so rational, and that we need to get technical in all of the communication. What are your thoughts on using emotion in B2B?
So I think in particular, emotion is underrated in B2B. So I will overstate the point just because I really feel it is sort of like it's an opportunity for differentiation. But also emotion is how you build mental availability, in the sense of you need a spike of emotion to be worth worth remembering. And actually linking your category entry point or your relevance to the brand, the answering of a need, means that you're answering an emotional need in your customer, but also creating an emotional moment with what we call a spike rating in an ad, and is a way of making it more memorable and creating a brand association with that. If you just serve people facts and figures about your business, they might get some residual brand information, but you run the risk, if you don't find a way of being memorable, of just advertising your category rather than your brand. And you've got to distinguish your brand. You have to be you know, otherwise you're just the sort of generic grey brand that could be anyone. And, you know, we're not here to grow our categories as much as our brands within our categories. Like, it's lovely to grow the category, but if you don't get the advantage of that, the category leader does, then, you know, you've just paid a very expensive price. I think on the other point, I have one thing to say on, and I'll be really quick on this one, but when we're targeting, we target very precisely. We see this huge trend for hyper targeting because people think, oh, it's more efficient to target really precisely, but it's really expensive. If you look at the way to actually get the best value from your media, targeting really broadly, especially on digital platforms, LinkedIn's a great example of this. If you target your whole category, your cost per hit is significantly cheaper, and you get an incredibly broad spread of people. And I would say, if I could say anything, I'm on a bit of a mission to kill hyper targeting, because it's an incredibly expensive way of reaching fewer people, which is exactly the opposite of what we should all be doing.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. And John, just final question before we ask you guys what's going on at the B2BI and 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute in the future.
Yeah.
But physical presence, I mean, we talk mental availability, but I know in consumer goods, physical presence is a big factor to play. If you can't find a brand, then you're not going to buy it, are you? Yes. What role does physical presence play in B2B?
Yeah, I mean, it's still super important, and physical availability is not necessarily about infrastructure. I mean, it can be assisted by infrastructure. So for example, if we can use the example of corporate banking again, the market leading brands have a huge advantage because of their infrastructure, which is largely built to support a retail business model. But what that means is that they can have corporate account management available in most large cities in the world. So they have an overwhelming advantage in physical availability. Physical availability can be built by the sales team. So being easy to buy from can be a function of having an appropriately disciplined and wide-ranging, sales regime. And in actual fact, when we reviewed quite a lot of brand metrics for a large global client that was in B2B, we noticed that they had some undervalued market research, which was a lot of their client base was surveyed in a syndicated survey, and they were asked, which of these corporations do you use? And then they're also asked, well, have you had any representation from this brand or this brand or this brand or this brand or this brand in the last 3 months? And what that enabled was to kind of work out, well, the proportion of the marketing brand's budget that was being allocated towards calling on existing customers versus new customers. And what we found was that the ones that kind of shifted their total resource allocation somewhat more to calling new customers, like prospects, actually the market share tended to nudge up a little bit, which kind of makes sense. If you're spending too much of your time talking to your existing customers, how's your market share going to grow? So just being a little bit intelligent and allocating a little bit more push to go out and talk to people who don't currently deal with you, there is some evidence of that works in B2B.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so what's up next for the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute? What are you guys working on at the moment?
Well, good question. We're continuing to build our knowledge base in B2B and B2B services. Just a couple of things, things that we're just starting to think about. One is, I mean, we're all familiar with the pervasive Net Promoter Score. And collectively, millions of dollars are spent by corporations on measuring and managing things according to Net Promoter based on the bold claims about it. And the question is, well, does it really predict growth? I think that's a big question to be addressed.
Very excited.
As one of many.
Very excited. We'll obviously give our attendees your contact details at the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute to get in touch with the Institute if they want to subscribe and follow your work, which is amazing. John, thank you so much. Jen, what is the B2B Eye up to next? What paper is coming next?
So we've got two big publications coming up. One is Equity Every Day, which is looking at the role of fairness in marketing as marketers and amongst ourselves. I think that's going to be really important and answers quite a lot of questions that we're all raising at the moment around like how race in particular is working in business, how it's we represent ourselves. I think of marketing as the window to the corporate soul. And so if we don't get it right ourselves as marketers, then we're never going to get it right as businesses as a whole. The other thing we're working on is our next trends publication, which should be a bumper trends this year, because we've had lots of new ideas. It's been a big year for change. It's in particular in the sort of major digitization of B2B, the accessibility of our businesses this year has been astonishing. So we're going to be looking at that. That'll be our seventh year of trends. So quite a long ongoing one. Really looking forward to it. And more work with the 𝑬𝒉𝒏 Institute, of which we are massive fans at the B2B Institute. We love these guys.
Very excited. I hope a lot more B2B stuff coming out of them, and great to hear that John mentioned that. So, on behalf of Turn Left Media, we want to thank you both for participating today and really providing some amazing insights and getting your views. Real privilege to get you speaking here on the continent.